Sunday lunches at my son's house had become a routine I endured more than enjoyed. That day, I carried a casserole in my hands, trying to remind myself I was still part of the family. The dining room buzzed with chatter, clinking glasses, and the forced cheerfulness of neighbors who had been invited without my knowledge. I sat quietly, folding my napkin on my lap, when I heard her voice low, but just sharp enough to pierce the air. "She's just a burden living here," my daughter-in-law whispered to the couple next to her. The words didn't need to be shouted. They carried perfectly in the silence that followed. A few neighbors exchanged uncomfortable glances, one even shifting in his chair as if the insult had landed on him too. I felt my cheeks burn, not from age, but from humiliation. My fork trembled against the plate as I forced myself to sit upright. I had given up so much: my savings, my comfort, my independence, just to keep peace after my husband died. And here I was, being painted as dead weight in my own son's home. My heart pounded, not with weakness, but with something sharper. Rage and grief fused into a determination I hadn't felt in years. I excused myself from the table, walking out with my head high, though inside I wanted to collapse. The whispers followed me like shadows, yet I knew something none of them did. This wasn't the end. Hours later, everyone who had pitied me would watch me return with someone they never expected. What would you do if your daughter-in-law said something like this about you in front of the whole neighborhood? Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to know how you'd handle it. After I left that Sunday lunch, I sat in my room replaying her words again and again. "She's just a burden living here." They echoed louder than any church bell I'd ever heard, pounding in my head long into the night. I'd been humiliated before. Life has its ways of bruising a woman who has lived over 70 years, but never like this. Never in front of neighbors. Never with such cruelty dripping from the lips of the woman who had married my only son. To understand why it cut so deep, you have to know where I came from. I was married to Robert for 40 years. We built a life together from scratch, starting in a tiny rented apartment and eventually buying the house where I still lived. It wasn't much by the standards of the wealthy families in town, but it was ours, paid for with long hours, shared sacrifices, and Robert's steady work at the auto plant. When he died, my world collapsed. I leaned on my son for support, never imagining that his wife would see me not as family, but as baggage. At first, things seemed manageable. My daughter-in-law smiled sweetly when I moved in, even insisting she would help with dinners and shopping. But sweetness can hide poison. Slowly, the little slights began. She would forget to tell me when neighbors were coming over. She would shift family photos so that my picture with Robert ended up half hidden behind her wedding portrait. And she started watching me closely whenever bills or financial mail arrived, as if waiting for me to slip up. I told myself I was imagining things. Grief can make you suspicious, and I didn't want to be the kind of mother-in-law who nitpicked. But then came the first time she shoved a stack of papers under my nose. "Just sign here," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's about the utilities, nothing big." I hesitated, reading the fine print, and sure enough, the document had more than just utility language. It included something about household management rights. I pushed it back to her and said, "If it's nothing big, then you don't mind explaining it." She laughed it off, but her eyes narrowed. That was the moment I realized she was playing a longer game. Her behavior escalated after that. She took control of the checkbook, insisting she was more organized. She stopped inviting me to family outings, and when I asked about it, she'd wave a hand and say, "Oh, you wouldn't have enjoyed it anyway." But the real alarm bell rang when I overheard her talking on the phone one evening. I was coming down the hallway when I caught her voice. "Once the paperwork is finalized, she won't be a problem anymore. The house will be under our name, and she'll have nowhere to go." I froze. It felt like ice water had been poured down my back. The house Robert and I worked for, the only legacy I had left, was being treated like a prize to be stolen. From that moment on, I stopped seeing myself as a victim. I started watching. Every time she smirked, every time she whispered, I tucked it away like a bead on a string. I began writing notes, dates, small details about conversations. I checked the mail early, looking for suspicious envelopes. When she came back from errands with documents in her purse, I noticed. And one afternoon, when she left her phone on the counter while she ran to grab laundry, I glanced at the screen. There was a message preview from someone saved as M. It read, "Make sure she signs the copy. Without it, Nothing moves forward. My pulse quickened, but I didn't touch the phone again. Instead, I knew I needed proof that couldn't be twisted. That's when the idea came. I'd record her. It wasn't easy. She was clever, and she rarely said anything openly when my son was around. But when she thought it was just us, she let the venom drip. One morning, while she was berating me for leaving dishes in the sink, dishes she herself had dirtied, I kept my phone on the table, recording every word. Later that week, she muttered to a neighbor over coffee that I was one step away from being carted off to a nursing home. That, too, I captured. It wasn't much yet, but it was a beginning. The turning point came when she tried again with the paperwork. She waved another stack in front of me, insisting that I needed to sign quickly because the mortgage company required it. I asked calmly, "Why would there be a mortgage? This house is paid off." Her face went pale, then red, then back to pale again. She stammered, "Well, it's complicated." That night, I recorded myself recounting everything she'd said, time-stamped, just in case. I thought I was alone in this fight, until a knock on my door changed everything. It was Mrs. Carter, the neighbor across the street. She stepped in, closed the door, and said softly, "I don't mean to interfere, but I think you should know I saw your daughter-in-law meeting a man by the driveway last week." He handed her a folder, and she tucked it under her jacket. When she saw me looking, she rushed inside. That confession lit a fire in me. It meant I wasn't imagining things. I had an ally, someone who could confirm what I suspected. But I also knew it wasn't safe to confront my daughter-in-law alone, not with how cunning she had become. If I accused her without evidence, she would turn the story around, make me look like a bitter old woman losing her mind. I couldn't afford that, not with my dignity on the line. So I stayed quiet. I smiled when she smirked. I nodded when she handed me chores. I even let her think I was too frail to notice her whispers, but inside, I was building a case, one piece at a time. What do you think? Was she just being rude? Or was she already plotting something far worse? Comment your guess below. I want to see who can predict the twist before it's revealed. I began to live two lives after that Sunday. On the outside, I kept playing the role of the aging widow, quiet and harmless, the one my daughter-in-law could sneer at without consequence. But inside, I was sharpening every sense I had left. She thought she had broken me down, but the truth was, she had awakened a part of me that Robert used to admire most, my stubborn will. The first major crack in her facade came on a Thursday morning. I was dusting the hallway when I heard her voice float out from the kitchen. She didn't know I was nearby. Her tone was sharp, impatient, the way people sound when they think no one is listening. "No, she hasn't signed yet," she hissed into the phone. "I'm trying, but she's suspicious. We need another angle. Just send me the updated draft." My heart thudded. She wasn't just scheming, she had an accomplice. I crept back into my room before she could catch me. That night, while the house was quiet, I replayed the moment over and over. I realized I needed proof that didn't rely on my memory or my word against hers. That's when I took Robert's old digital recorder out of the desk drawer. He used it years ago to dictate notes for work. I charged it up and slipped it into my apron pocket the next day. At first, I felt nervous. What if she found it? But then, an opportunity came almost immediately. She cornered me in the kitchen, shoving a stack of papers across the counter. "Just sign here already," she snapped. "You're dragging this out." Her voice was thick with irritation. "The bank needs it, or else you'll lose what little security you have left." I kept my face blank and said, "I'll look at it later." Inside, my recorder was capturing every word. When she stormed off muttering about dead weight, I knew I had her. That night, I played it back, hands trembling. The sound was clear, her tone unmistakable. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. But I needed more. One recording could be brushed off as a bad day. I decided to bide my time, to let her think she was winning while I collected her arrogance like evidence in a courtroom. Days later, I overheard her gossiping with a neighbor by the mailbox. "She'll be gone soon," she said with a sly grin. "This house won't be hers much longer." The neighbor looked uncomfortable, shifting their feet, but didn't challenge her. I stayed hidden behind the curtain, my recorder pressed to the window screen. That clip joined the first one in my growing collection. My suspicion deepened when envelopes began arriving in the mail, addressed to me, but intercepted by her. I caught her tearing one open before I could reach it. She froze, then quickly said, "Oh, I thought it was mine." But I saw the bold letters, "Property Tax Notice." Later that night, I found the letter discarded in the trash, ripped in half. I taped it back together, slid it into my folder of evidence, and promised myself I'd watch the mailbox from then on. The more I watched, the more I saw. Phone calls taken in hushed tones, folders slipped into handbags, conversations that stopped the second I entered the room. Once, I even found a notepad on the counter with scribbled words, "Transfer title, signatures needed." When she noticed it missing later, she ransacked the kitchen. But I had already hidden the torn page in my dresser drawer. Still, I needed someone besides me to see what was happening. That's when fate sent me Mrs. Carter again. She came over one afternoon under the pretense of borrowing sugar. As soon as my daughter-in-law left the room, she leaned in close. "I saw her again," she whispered. "She was with that man in the black car, passing papers. I don't know what's going on, but it didn't look right." I nodded, feeling my chest tighten with both fear and relief. "Would you be willing to tell someone that if I asked?" I asked her quietly. She hesitated, then said, "If it comes to that, yes, you don't deserve what she's doing." It was the validation I needed. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I was right. From that day forward, I set up a routine. I kept the recorder with me at all times. I noted dates and times in a little notebook. I checked the locks on my cabinet where I stored the growing pile of papers, ripped envelopes, and transcribed notes. My daughter-in-law strutted around, convinced she was outsmarting me, but really, she was giving me all the ammunition I needed. The most damning recording came late one night. She thought I was asleep, but I had crept to the top of the stairs with the recorder in hand. She was on the phone again. "Don't worry," she said, her voice sharp. "Once she's out, the house is ours. She's too old to fight back, and her son won't question me." I nearly gasped, but I held my breath until she hung up. When I replayed that line, my heart pounded so hard I could barely hear the words. That was no longer suspicion, that was intent. By the end of the week, I had hours of recordings, fragments of documents, and a neighbor willing to back me up, but it still wasn't enough. I knew if I confronted her with what I had, she'd twist it, maybe even destroy the evidence. I needed something bigger, something undeniable. That's when I made the hardest decision of all. I picked up the phone and called the local police. I asked to speak to an officer off the record, someone who could advise me. The woman on the line listened patiently as I explained my situation. When I finished, she said, "Keep collecting. Don't confront her yet. The more evidence you gather, the stronger your case will be. And if she crosses a line, call us immediately." I knew one. I hung up with my heart racing. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. There was a plan forming, and soon she would have no idea what hit her. Once I had hours of recordings and a folder thick with scraps of evidence, I knew I couldn't hold this burden alone any longer. My daughter-in-law's arrogance was growing by the day, and with each sneer, each whispered jab, I reminded myself that silence could no longer protect me. It was time to bring someone else into the fight. That someone turned out to be Mrs. Carter. She knocked on my door one cool morning with a pie in her hands and a look of nervous determination on her face. After a few pleasantries, she lowered her voice. "I couldn't keep this to myself," she said. "I've seen her with that man again." He gave her another folder. This time, I could see bold letters on the cover, something about transfer. I invited her inside and closed the door. My hands trembled slightly as I opened my drawer and pulled out my growing pile of evidence. "You're not the only one who's noticed," I whispered. I showed her the ripped tax notice, the scribbled notepad page, and, finally, I played a portion of one of the recordings. Her eyes widened. "She really said that?" Mrs. Carter asked, pressing her palm to her chest. I nodded. "She thinks she can take everything from me right here in my son's home while making me look like the crazy old woman." Oh. Mrs. Carter took a deep breath. "If you need me to speak to someone official, I will. I don't like being in the middle of family matters, but this isn't right. You deserve better." It felt like the first real lifeline I had grasped in months. A witness, someone outside the family, willing to tell the truth. That afternoon, after pacing my room for hours, I picked up the phone again and called the officer I had spoken with before. When she answered, I told her about Mrs. Carter. She's willing to testify, I said. She's seen my daughter-in-law taking documents from a man in a car. I have recordings, letters, even notes. It's not just my word anymore. The officer listened carefully, then said, "This is serious. Do not confront your daughter-in-law directly. If you can, continue documenting everything. And if you're willing, we can arrange a meeting where you and your neighbor can provide statements." I agreed, though my heart hammered in my chest. It was one thing to whisper suspicions to myself. It was another to bring them into the light of day. But I knew the time had come. 2 days later, Mrs. Carter and I sat together at the local police station. The officer was kind, offering us water and listening without interruption. Mrs. Carter described what she had seen, the secret meetings, the folders passed quickly, the guilty look when she realized she'd been spotted. Then it was my turn. I slid the folder of documents across the table. The officer leafed through them slowly, pausing at the taped-together tax notice and the scribbled page. When I pulled out the recorder, my hands shook, but I pressed play anyway. My daughter-in-law's voice filled the small room. "Once she's out, the house is ours. She's too old to fight back, and her son won't question me." The officer looked up sharply. "That's clear intent. Combined with the documents and your neighbor's statement, this paints a troubling picture. We can't arrest her yet, but we can open a file and monitor the situation. If she pushes further, if she tries to force a signature or transfer property, we'll intervene." I exhaled a shaky breath, both relieved and frightened. This wasn't just family drama anymore. It was now a matter of law. Walking home that evening, I felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because I no longer carried the secret alone, heavier because I knew the storm was about to break. I replayed the officer's words in my mind. "Don't confront her yet. Let her make the next move." So I waited. That Sunday, the house filled with neighbors again. My daughter-in-law floated around like the queen she believed herself to be, refilling glasses, laughing too loudly, and dropping subtle digs in my direction. "Some people just don't know when it's time to move into assisted living," she said at one point, her voice sweet but poisonous. Laughter rippled uncomfortably around the table. I smiled politely and said nothing. Inside, my recorder was running, and my heart beat steadily with the knowledge that the truth was closing in. Later that evening, I caught sight of her slipping into the study with another stack of papers. My curiosity pulled me to the doorway, careful to stay out of sight. She was on the phone again. "I'll have her sign it this week," she muttered. "If not, I'll find a way to push it through. She's weak. She won't fight." I pressed the recorder tighter in my palm. Every arrogant word she spoke became another nail in the coffin of her scheme. By the time she left the room, my plan was fully formed. The next Sunday, when she gathered the neighbors again to show off her false charm, she would get the shock of her life. Because I wouldn't be coming alone. I would be walking in with the one group she never expected to see standing behind me. The law. If this were your family, would you keep the matter private or call the police like I did? Tell me in the comments. I know this will divide opinions. The following Sunday, I woke before dawn. My hands shook slightly as I buttoned my blouse, not from weakness, but from anticipation. For a week, I had carried the weight of knowing that the truth was finally ready to be revealed. The police had assured me they would be nearby, ready to step in if things escalated. I glanced at the folder on my dresser, the recorder, the documents, the notes, everything I had collected, and slipped it into my handbag. Today wasn't going to be another Sunday lunch where I endured humiliation. Today, it would become a reckoning. By noon, the house buzzed again with the familiar hum of neighbors. My daughter-in-law loved an audience, and once more she had filled the dining room with people who would witness her perform. She floated between the guests with a wide smile, offering glasses of wine, making light conversation. But even her laughter had an edge. I knew her well enough to recognize the nerves beneath the surface. She was waiting for her chance to spring whatever trap she had been preparing. I took my usual seat at the end of the table. My son sat beside his wife, looking weary but compliant. He had grown used to her leading the show, and though he rarely joined her in cruelty, he never stopped her either. The roast chicken, the mashed potatoes, the salads, everything looked perfect, as always. But I could hardly taste the food. My focus was on the moment to come. It didn't take long. As plates were passed and glasses refilled, my daughter-in-law leaned forward, her voice sweet as honey, but loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "I admire her spirit," she said, glancing toward me. "But some people don't know when to let go. It's sad when the elderly cling to houses and responsibilities they can't manage anymore." The table went silent. Forks paused mid-air. A neighbor cleared his throat. She smiled, satisfied, as though she had scored a point in a game only she was playing. That was my cue. I placed my napkin carefully on the table, then reached into my bag. My hands no longer trembled. I pulled out the small recorder and pressed play. Her voice filled the room instantly. "Once she's out, the house is ours. She's too old to fight back, and her son won't question me." The sound hung in the air like a thunderclap. Gasps broke out around the table. My son's head snapped toward his wife, his face draining of color. She lurched to her feet. "That's not no, that's taken out of context," she stammered. But I wasn't finished. From my bag, I pulled the taped-together property tax notice and the torn notepad page with her handwriting. Transfer title, signatures needed. I laid them on the table like cards in a poker game. "Does that look like context to you?" I asked evenly. My daughter-in-law's face flushed crimson. "You don't understand," she spat. It's complicated legal stuff you wouldn't get." At that moment, Mrs. Carter rose from her chair at the far end of the table. Her voice was steady. "I saw you, twice, meeting a man in a black car. He gave you folders, and you tried to hide them. Don't pretend this is innocent." The room erupted in murmurs. Neighbors whispered to each other, eyes wide, some reaching for their phones to record. My son's hands clenched into fists on the table. "I can explain." My daughter-in-law tried again, her voice trembling now. "No, you can't," I interrupted. "Because this isn't just about family anymore. This is fraud. This is theft. And I won't let you bury me to steal what Robert and I worked for our whole lives." As if on cue, there was a firm knock at the door. My son got up in confusion, but before he could reach it, 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. The room fell utterly silent. One officer nodded at me. "Ma'am, are you ready to proceed?" I stood slowly, my back straight, my voice calm. "Yes. Everything you need is right here." I handed them the folder with my evidence. My daughter-in-law's composure shattered. "You called the police? Are you insane? This is a family matter." The officer's voice was cool. "Not anymore, ma'am. This involves legal documents and potential property fraud. That's a criminal matter." She turned desperately to my son. Tell them this is just a misunderstanding." But for the first time, my son didn't rush to defend her. He looked at me, at the recorder still on the table, at the papers, at Mrs. Carter, and finally at the officers. His face was pale, his voice quiet. I think we need to let them do their job." Her mouth fell open in shock. She spun toward the neighbors, but their eyes no longer held admiration or complicity. They looked at her with disgust, with pity, with condemnation. The queen of her little stage had just lost her crown. The officers asked her to sit while they examined the evidence. She refused, shouting about betrayal, about how I was turning everyone against her, but her words fell flat. Every sentence was another desperate attempt to rewrite reality, and no one believed her anymore. I stayed silent, my chin lifted. I didn't need to gloat. The truth was doing all the work for me. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, the officers closed the folder and stood. "We'll be reviewing this further, but based on what we see here, there are grounds to open a formal investigation. We'll need you to come with us for questioning." The dining room was so quiet, you could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall. My daughter-in-law's face twisted, fury and fear colliding. "You'll regret this," she hissed at me. "You'll all regret this. I'll go." But when the officers guided her toward the door, her words sounded less like a threat and more like the whimper of someone who knew the game was up. As the door closed behind them, a collective breath seemed to escape the room. The neighbors looked at me, their eyes no longer pitying, but wide with something closer to respect. "Mrs. Carter gave me a small nod, as if to say, 'You did it.'" My son sat back down, his hands covering his face. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then he whispered, "Mom, I had no idea." I touched his shoulder gently. "You weren't meant to." She played her part well. But now the truth is out. And as I looked around that table at the shocked faces, the whispered conversations starting again, I realized that my humiliation had turned into vindication. What began as a public shaming had ended as a public unveiling of the truth. This was no longer just my story. It was a lesson every person in that room would carry. Underestimate a quiet woman at your peril. The silence that followed her exit with the officers didn't last long. As soon as the door clicked shut, voices filled the dining room. Neighbors whispered to one another, exchanging shocked looks, some replaying what they'd just heard on the recording. My son sat hunched over at the table, his face in his hands, as if the weight of the world had come crashing down on his shoulders. And then, just as quickly, the front door swung open again. My daughter-in-law stormed back into the room, her hair disheveled, her cheeks flushed an angry red. The officers had allowed her to retrieve her bag before taking her downtown, and in those few seconds, she'd found the courage to put on one last performance. "You're all fools," she spat, slamming her purse down on the table. Glasses rattled, and mashed potatoes slopped over the edge of a bowl. Do you really believe her? An old woman who can barely keep her thoughts straight? She's manipulating you all because she's jealous. Jealous that I took her place in this house. Jealous that her son loves me. Her voice cracked, shrill, and desperate. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. No one looked convinced. I remained seated, my hands folded neatly in front of me. "You can scream all you want," I said softly, "but the truth doesn't disappear just because you shout over it." That only enraged her more. She grabbed the property tax notice from the folder the officers had been reviewing and waved it wildly in the air. "This doesn't mean anything. Anyone could have written this down. She forged it. She's setting me up." "Careful," Mrs. Carter said from across the table, her voice firm. "I was the one who saw you with those folders. Don't drag us into your lies." My daughter-in-law's eyes flicked toward Mrs. Carter with venom. "Oh, of course," she sneered. "The lonely widow who has nothing better to do than spy on her neighbors. Perfect witness." But her words only made the room colder. The neighbors who had once been her audience now sat stiff, some glaring, some shaking their heads. Her performance was unraveling. My son finally lifted his head, his expression pained. "Stop it," he said quietly. "You've humiliated yourself enough." She whirled on him, eyes blazing. "You're siding with her? After everything I've done for you? After all the sacrifices I made to keep this house running? You'd throw me to the wolves because of a few scraps of paper and a bitter old woman's voice recorder?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. The silence was louder than any words could have been. Sensing her grip slipping, she tried a different tactic. She clutched her stomach, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. I did it for us, for our future. I was trying to protect us from her draining everything we've built. She's selfish, clinging to a house she can't even maintain. I wanted us to be secure." I stood then, slowly, deliberately. "Secure?" I asked. "By stealing from a widow? By plotting to throw me out of my home, the only place Robert and I ever built together? If that's your definition of secure, then you've mistaken cruelty for responsibility." The room was deathly still. For the first time, she seemed to realize no one was on her side. Her shoulders sagged, her chest heaved, and then the mask slipped completely. "You all think you're better than me," she hissed, her voice low and poisonous. "But you've never lived with nothing. You've never been desperate enough to claw for what you deserve. That house should have been mine the moment I married into this family. I earned it, more than she ever did." Gasps rippled through the room. Even my son looked as if he had been struck across the face. "Earned it?" he repeated, his voice hollow. "Yes," she shouted. "While she sits around collecting sympathy, I'm the one who runs this household. I'm the one who makes the decisions, who deals with the neighbors, who manages the money. She's nothing but dead weight, and if you had any sense, you'd see I was right to try to cut her out." Her words hung in the air like poison, and for the first time, there was no hiding the truth. The carefully crafted image she had spent years building had shattered, replaced by raw greed and bitterness. I met her eyes, steady and calm. "And now everyone sees you for who you really are." She lunged toward me then, her hand raised as if to strike. But before she could reach me, two officers who had been waiting by the door stepped forward and caught her arms. She screamed, twisting in their grip, hurling insults at everyone in the room. "You'll regret this, all of you. You think she's innocent? She's nothing. Nothing." The officers guided her firmly out the door once more, her voice echoing down the hallway until it was muffled by the closing door. Silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence this time. heavy, final, filled with the weight of what had just been revealed. I sank back into my chair, exhausted but unbroken. Around me, the neighbors avoided each other's eyes, as if embarrassed by how easily they had once been charmed by her. Mrs. Carter gave me a small, approving nod. My son stared at the table, shame written across his face. The performance was over. The mask had fallen, and my daughter-in-law's empire of lies was crumbling before everyone's eyes. The officers didn't waste any time once they had her out of the dining room. From where I sat, I could still hear the muffled sound of her protests drifting in from the porch. Neighbors who had stayed behind exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering to each other, others shaking their heads in disbelief. For years, they had believed the image she projected: an attentive wife, a polite hostess, the woman who kept the household together. In a matter of minutes, that image had collapsed into dust. One of the officers returned to the table, the folder of evidence in his hand. His voice was professional, but his words carried a weight that silenced every murmur in the room. We've seen cases like this before: forged documents, attempts to transfer property without consent. It's serious. From what we have here, and from the recordings and witness statements, we have grounds to move forward. She'll be coming with us for questioning tonight. A collective gasp rose from the neighbors. Some pulled out their phones to text, their faces lit by the glow of their screens. Others simply stared, stunned, as the officer's words sank in. My son's face was pale, his eyes fixed on the folder, as if it were a loaded weapon. My daughter-in-law's voice broke through again, louder this time, as the second officer escorted her back inside briefly. "This is ridiculous. You can't arrest me over some scribbles and gossip." Her hair clung to her damp forehead, her lipstick smudged, her hands twitching in agitation. The officer holding her arm spoke evenly. "You're not under arrest yet, ma'am, but you are being brought in for questioning. If the investigation confirms fraud or attempted theft, charges will follow." She froze, her eyes darting wildly around the room. "Fraud? Theft? This is my house too. My husband lives here. His name should be on everything." At that, my son finally lifted his head. His voice was low, but it cut through the air like a blade. "Number, this house has always belonged to my parents. Dad and Mom paid for it, every brick, every nail. I never signed it away, and neither did she. You had no right." Her face crumpled in disbelief. "You're really going to take her side?" He swallowed hard, then looked at me with regret, before turning back to her. "I'm not taking sides. I'm facing the truth. And the truth is, you lied to me, to everyone here. You've been scheming behind my back, trying to cheat my own mother out of her home." The room was so quiet, the ticking clock on the wall felt deafening. She let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You men are all the same weak. Letting old women control you. Letting them guilt you into believing their sob stories. She's playing you, can't you see that?" I didn't flinch. I let her words hang there, hollow and bitter, until the officer gave her arm a tug. She jerked against him, her voice rising into a near scream. "This isn't over. You'll all regret treating me like this. I'll ruin you before you ruin me." Phones were out now. Several neighbors had begun recording, their lenses trained on her wild gestures, her shrill voice, her frantic eyes. The woman who once prided herself on her composure and charm was unraveling in front of an audience that would never forget. "Ma'am," the officer said firmly, "I suggest you calm down. Anything further you say can be noted in the report." Ivor. Her mouth opened and closed, as if she wanted to lash out again, but the fight was gone from her eyes. She slumped in the officer's grip, glaring at me one last time, before being escorted out the door for good. The slam of the door echoed like the final note of a song. For a long moment, the dining room was silent. Then the neighbors began to speak, their voices hushed but urgent. "I can't believe it. All this time, and she was plotting behind everyone's back. Good thing you stood your ground." Mrs. Carter reached across the table and touched my hand gently. "You were right not to stay silent. You saved yourself, and probably others, from her schemes." I nodded, though my throat was tight with emotion. "It wasn't easy," I admitted, "but I couldn't let her destroy everything Robert and I built." My son rose slowly, his eyes glistening with shame. "Mom," he said hoarsely, "I don't know how to make this right. I should have seen it sooner." I placed a hand on his arm. "The important thing is you see it now. She fooled everyone, not just you. He nodded, but the guilt didn't leave his eyes. As the neighbors gathered their things to leave, many stopped to squeeze my hand, to offer a kind word, to promise they'd stand by me if needed. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel pitied. I felt respected. When the last guest left, I sat in the quiet dining room, staring at the remnants of the meal. Plates half full, glasses still smeared with fingerprints, a table that had witnessed betrayal, revelation, and collapse all in one afternoon. I felt drained, but there was a strength in me that hadn't been there before. The mask my daughter-in-law had worn for so long was gone. What remained was the truth, and the truth had finally spoken louder than her lies. What do you think? Should someone like her ever be forgiven after plotting something so cruel, or should she face the full weight of the law? Leave your verdict in the comments. I'm curious to see how divided you all are. That night, after the neighbors had gone and the officers had driven my daughter-in-law away for questioning, I sat alone in the living room. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels alive, pulsing with everything that had just happened. The lamp on the end table cast a warm glow over the photographs on the wall, pictures of Robert smiling, of family holidays long past, of moments when I believed love and loyalty were enough to hold everything together. I touched one of the frames gently, my fingers brushing over Robert's face. "We did it," I whispered. "She won't take this from us." My voice cracked, but it carried more relief than sorrow. For months, I had lived in fear of being erased, of losing the last piece of the life we built. Now, for the first time, I felt the ground steady beneath my feet again. My son entered quietly, his face drawn, his eyes red. He sat down across from me, elbows on his knees, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, "I'm so sorry, Mom. I let her manipulate me. I thought she was protecting our family, but all along she was tearing it apart." I studied him, the boy I had raised into a man who had somehow lost his way. "You trusted her," I said softly. "Trust isn't a weakness, but refusing to see the truth that can be. What matters now is that you see it." He nodded, tears glistening. "Do you think they'll put her in jail?" I sighed. "That's not for me to decide. The law will handle her now. Whether she faces punishment or not, she's already lost the one thing she valued most, her mask. Everyone saw who she really was." We sat in silence again, the weight of everything pressing down. Then I straightened in my chair. "You know, she was right about one thing. I am old. I do move slower than I used to. But that doesn't mean I'm useless. It doesn't mean I'm weak. I still have a voice, and I'll use it as long as I'm breathing." The next morning, news had already spread through the neighborhood. People stopped me on my walk to the mailbox, offering words of encouragement. "You were brave," one woman said. "I would have been too scared to stand up like that." Another added, "You taught us something yesterday. We should never stay quiet when we know the truth." For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a burden. I felt like a survivor. As days passed, the investigation deepened. Officers came by to ask follow-up questions, to collect more recordings. Mrs. Carter gave her statement formally, her voice steady and unwavering. My daughter-in-law's reputation crumbled faster than I could have imagined. Friends avoided her. Neighbors who once laughed at her jokes now crossed the street to keep their distance. She had built her image on deception, and once the lies fell away, nothing was left to admire. One evening, I sat on the porch watching the sunset. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of freshly cut grass. For the first time in a long while, I felt peace. Not because everything was perfect, far from it, but because I had faced humiliation, betrayal, and fear, and I had walked through it without breaking. I realized then that revenge doesn't always come in fire and fury. Sometimes it comes in truth, in exposing what someone tried so hard to hide. My daughter-in-law wanted to reduce me to nothing more than a burden. Instead, she revealed herself to be the burden, the weight of lies, of greed, of cruelty that had poisoned our family. I picked up my tea, took a slow sip, and let the warmth steady me. My life wasn't over. It was beginning again, on my terms. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, someone inside your own family, you know how deeply it cuts. But take it from me, silence only feeds their power. Speak up. Hold your ground. The truth might not erase the pain, but it will set you free. If you've lived through betrayal like this, share your story in the comments. You're not alone, and I'd love to hear how you found your strength. And if you want more true stories like mine, subscribe and stay with me because together we prove that no one is ever too old to fight back.